We'll now go on to a keynote session. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Ansgar Koene. He is Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at Ernst & Young. He's also a Senior Research Fellow at the Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute at the University of Nottingham. His expertise includes, among others, policy and governance of algorithmic systems, data privacy, AI ethics, and AI standards. At Ernst & Young, he works on AI governance, trusted AI frameworks, and AI-related public policy engagement. And at Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute, his work covers policy impact and public engagement activities of the institute. There he works on the Trust project, which is a project on rebuilding and enhancing trust in algorithms. He also works on the Unbiased project. He has led and contributed towards many standardization efforts. He chairs the IEEE P7003 standard for algorithmic bias considerations working group. He has contributed and participated in several other important standardization initiatives with IEEE and the European Public Policy Committee for ICT. He also participates in the CENELEC focus group for AI. I hope I got the pronunciation right there. And the ISO committee for standardization in the area of AI. He's also trustee for Phi Rights Committee for Phi Rights Foundation for the Rights of Young People Online, and is part of the Phi Rights Digital Futures Committee. With that said, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Ansgar Koene to present his keynote. Please welcome him.
Hi, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. It is my pleasure to join you and to give this presentation. So my talk today is going to focus on the combination really of ethics, standards, and regulation for trustworthy AI ecosystem. Really, what I want to get at is, first of all, why we are seeing the kind of developments that are currently happening around the policy of developing towards regulation for AI, and then how do standards play a role within this ecosystem? What kind of what is the relationship between standards and regulation? How does standards work, which is something that many in our community can easily get engaged with? How does that contribute to really the implementation of regulations around AI? So let me get my, first of all, just let me share my screen. There. Okay. So AI ethics standards and regulation for a trustworthy AI ecosystem. So basically, where are we? As a society, basically, we've moved towards a data-driven society, focusing on collecting increasing numbers of data in order to be able to customize the way in which our services operate to particular individuals, instead of operating at the kind of more coarse scale of demographics or other kinds of rough data features that have previously been used in order to try to identify what is most necessary for certain people in society or for certain aspects towards improving services or applications. There's also a drive to using this kind of data as part of policy making. This is part of the general push to make evidence-based policy making, try to make sure that we are not purely driven by ideology, but actually that we are testing the way in which policies and regulations operate to make sure that we are getting the best results for our societies. As part of this, we're seeing AI being used as the methodology, the means for operating on these data sets. It provides us with a methodology to be able to grasp much bigger data sets and try to find patterns within much more complicated multidimensional aspects of the data around society and the way in which we operate, as well as having the AI being implemented into increasing numbers of tools and processes such as manufacturing and those kinds of things that have increasingly significant impacts on society. Most of the time, these operate quite well. However, as we are moving towards applications of AI that have more significant implications for people and for the way in which organizations interoperate or the way in which society itself is working, we are, of course, seeing issues arising, and those have triggered quite a number of news stories around problems with algorithmic systems, problems with automated decision making. To a large extent, these are related to problems with anticipating the way in which these kinds of systems may have ulterior impacts beyond what was initially anticipated. If we think, for instance, around the huge concerns about the way in which social media recommender algorithms might be impacting on democratic processes, this is obviously not what these algorithms were initially intended for. However, this is a secondary impact that they are having, and to a certain extent, it has become a primary aim of how to use these algorithms by certain actors. But this has led, therefore, to concerns around, do we have the right kind of safeguards in place to make sure that these systems operate in the way that we as a society want them to operate? A clear case of, what has been driving these types of concerns are issues around bias. The question around whether or not the way in which the automated decision-making process is operating is potentially having a negative impact on certain parts within society. Is it the case that these systems operate only well for that majority sector that by its nature is the primary sort of customer base for the development of a lot of these systems, or the primary source of data based on which these systems are originally tested? So this was just one of the many studies that have revealed issues around bias in algorithmic systems. This one particularly was looking at a data driven kind of bias in face recognition systems, and showing how when effort is being made into making sure that the data sets are more properly balanced, that can actually resolve some of these challenges. And frequently that this will have a beneficial impact on the performance of the systems, not just for the minority group that perhaps in the previous data set wasn't sufficiently represented, but can actually even improve the performance of the system for everybody, because the system is driven to look more at the relevant characteristics. And really that's the issue. How do we make sure that the algorithmic systems are looking at the relevant aspects within the data? How do we clarify what it means this is a relevant aspect? For instance, if we think at things like anti-discrimination regulation, the basis of a lot of that is to say that making a differentiation between whether somebody's gender or somebody's race should not be a relevant aspect for their ability to perform a certain kind of role. And therefore that should not be a relevant, a valid factor for making a differentiation between who gets the job or not, or who gets eligibility for credit or not, or other kinds of decisions. So really the question there is around making sure that the way in which the algorithmic system is differentiating its performance is based on factors that are relevant to the task. Another aspect, and this came out in a particular kind of study also related to racial bias, but the focus, the element of this study that I'd like to focus on is that this was driven not by data questions, but by questions around how the optimization targets were being formulated. So that raises questions around how do we as a society actually make sure that the way in which these systems are being put into place goes through the correct kind of process, so that there is a buy-in from the population that says this is actually an acceptable direction to optimize in. So in this case, it was a question around whether or not a particular system, recidivism prediction in this case, would be unbiased relative to its accuracy, or should it be unbiased relative to false positives or relative to false negatives, considering that the system cannot be unbiased across all of these. That requires, therefore, a transparent decision-making process. It requires an ability to potentially challenge that decision as to which of these optimization factors is correct. And it requires a baseline, a understanding as to what are the rules based on which we say this kind of optimization direction is the more correct one, or this other one. The next element is making sure that we are actually using these systems in a way that respects human dignity. And so this is something that comes very much to the forefront with certain kinds of studies that have been proposed that are harking back to old kind of ideas of sort of phrenological ways of stereotyping people. AI systems give us the possibility of doing this. It is not necessarily the case that this actually, just because the AI system finds a certain pattern in the types of data that was presented, that does not equate to saying there is an actual scientific basis for this kind of cause and effect relationship. It doesn't actually establish a cause and effect relationship. But more importantly, the question is, even if the system, if it is possible to identify, in this case, somebody's sexuality based on the facial features, and I'm not saying that it is, but even if we were to assume that it were possible to do that, would it be proper to do so using a system that will assign that kind of a decision onto somebody else without them having an active engagement within that decision-making process? Does that not rid them of their human dignity, which is one aspect that is protected under the Convention of Human Rights? That last aspect links to a more general kind of question around the challenges that arise as we are applying AI systems to applications where perhaps it is less easy to find a clear ground truth. If we look at pure image recognition, such as face recognition, for instance, there is a clear ground truth. We can say, yes, this is that person, or no, it is not. However, if we move into other aspects, such as trying to predict certain things like their future job success based on certain data sets, even data sets that have traditionally been accepted, such as things like scores in their educational system, there is no actual clear ground truth to say that this is a predictor. All we can do is try to find something that seems to go in that direction and try to check through feedback loops whether or not this is working. However, there's a chance that the prediction itself is going to drive the outcome. And so it becomes very difficult to say that this system is fully reliable. So we need other kinds of checks against that. Finally, along sort of this background that drives the push towards trying to establish some regulation around how AI is being used, AI has raised quite a number of questions around ethics. Interestingly, more questions around ethics than what we found with most technologies, certainly most digital technologies. Granted, things like genetics have also raised a lot of ethical questions, but these are fairly outliers when it comes to the triggering of ethical debates due to a technology. One of the reasons, I believe at least, why AI specifically triggers this kinds of discussions around ethics, which other digital technologies like big data in itself or something hasn't triggered, is things like, is the basic terminology that we're using, the anthropomorphic terminology of artificial intelligence, automated decision-making, machine learning, all of these more human kind of terminology that project a certain property onto the system, which it doesn't actually have, but a property that is linked to other humans, and humans have ethical decision-making processes. So therefore, this triggers a thinking of we need to address this from an ethics perspective as opposed to from other kinds of legal perspectives. System complexity is another one. The fact that the systems are operating at their core based on, at least when we're talking machine learning, at their core based on statistical correlations. These are complicated statistics, and raising the question of whether or not decision making based on this kind of statistics is actually something which we as a society consider to be the correct approach for certain kinds of challenges in society. Do we consider it to be correct to make decisions in the criminal justice system, for instance, on the basis of statistics as opposed to on the basis of investigations of the fact around the case of that one particular individual? So, and then finally, just the way in which AI is linked to the public sort of image of the kind of certain companies involved in this space is also triggering some of the ethics questions. So all of these things is just to lay the groundwork of why is there such a push to say this type of technology needs us to look at it to put in place new kinds of regulations, whereas the internet for a very long time was allowed to develop without a strong regulatory response. Other technologies also, we often wait to a larger extent to the systems being truly implemented and used before putting in place regulations, whereas with AI, there's more of a tendency to fear that if we were to wait as long as we usually do before developing regulations, that then it would be too late to address some of these issues. So what does the sort of the policy debate around AI look like, generally speaking? So on the right, we have a map that just lays out which countries in the world have already developed national AI strategies or are in the process of doing so. And we can see this is quite a high sector of countries. There is, however, a strong bias within this, which is to say the majority of countries that have developed national AI strategies are in the global north, plus China and India. And whereas the global south largely is not really part of this conversation as of yet. And this is a challenge and a problem that needs to be addressed. Roughly speaking, the process that the policy debate goes through tends to be as follows, starting with fact-finding, things like expert consultations, asking for people from the technical community or from the industrial community or from civil society to raise the issues and clarify what it is that the challenges. Then we've seen this large wave of development of AI principles, and we are now at the count of how many AI principles have been published, be it national or corporate or otherwise, is currently in the hundreds, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but is a case. Then we tend to, from the principles, there's a movement towards the national AI strategies. These tend to focus largely on the question of where a country sees itself as how it would like to apply AI, whether it is going to be a driver of a certain type of AI technology or more of a consumer of these, whether it would like to push for a more strongly regulated environment or one that is more open market. Those kinds of questions are addressed to a certain extent in various national AI strategies, but they then give sort of the trigger towards looking at doing the legislative gap analysis. They try to, the assessment of, are the current legal frameworks that exist, for instance, legislative frameworks around making sure that the aviation industry is safe, or things like the financial sector or the health sector, each of these is a regulated space. Are the existing regulations in that space sufficient to address any kinds of new challenges that arise from AI, or do they need to be updated? And the same goes for other sectors. And then from that legislative gap analysis, there's a move to proposing new legislation or proposing amendments to legislation. As I mentioned, AI principles have proliferated greatly in the last couple of years. I would say 2019 and 20 were probably sort of the peak years for the publication of new AI principles. Probably the most important one when it comes as to thinking about a reference point for what national governments are looking at, and that will probably be also a reference point for where their future regulations are going to be related, is the OECD AI principles, which were also adopted by the G20. But largely they follow the same kind of pattern as most AI principles do, focusing on things such as inclusive growth, sustainability, development, and well-being. This covers things like bias as well. Human-centered values and fairness, transparency and explainability, robustness, security and safety, and accountability. The right column is more sort of recommendations for policymakers as to the direction in which to go, more sort of in the space of the national strategies. Before jumping into the EU example, to look into more sort of how those kinds of principles translate into thinking around regulation, I'd like to just point out some of the sort of main international or intergovernmental organizations in this space that are operating, that are looking to coordinate between different countries to make sure that the kinds of regulations that we get in one country don't diverge too much from that in other countries. So that's the OECD, which has quite a number of working groups in this space. The Council of Europe, which is one of the pushing forward with towards a legally binding instrument for democratic governance of AI. It is one of the few that is already pushing in the direction of legal binding. G20, as I mentioned, the Global Partnership on AI, which is sort of an affiliated to the OECD. UNESCO is coming out with its recommendations on ethics of AI, which is especially important because this is one of the few that is taking into account the voice of the global south. However, beyond this sort of, I'd say, the deliberative approach towards AI regulation, where there is this process of fact-finding and thinking through the challenges and crafting carefully developed regulation, there is also a reactive policy development process. And this is basically what we are seeing when people go to the street to protest over the use of an AI system. In the UK, for instance, last year in the summer, we had the huge protests against the algorithmic approach that was taken to compute students' grades that would decide whether they would be able to get access to get a seat in certain universities. Those kinds of mass protests can trigger a reactive policy development because policymakers have an obligation towards their constituents to address their issues. And so, for instance, we've seen this as one of the big drivers behind the legal bans on facial recognition. Huge protests especially in the US against the police use of face recognition in protest situations, triggering a number of city or statewide bans on the use of face recognition in certain kind of contexts, including also at the EU side. There was discussions around whether or not there should be a moratorium on face recognition technology. And we've seen some of this come into the AI Act. So there is this sort of secondary channel through which policy making and regulations are triggered, and which is something that developers of technology or deployers of this, including industry, need to take into consideration as part of making, one of the reasons why you would like to make the effort to create your system based on ethical principles, following standards that address best practices. So, as I said, I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on the EU policy around AI, primarily because simply it is one of the most developed in this space, and as such, it provides us with kind of an example that won't be too different from the direction that we will see other countries going into, though the specifics may diverge. And just before jumping into it, I'd like to focus in on sort of the geopolitics behind it, which has also been shaping the way in which this region has been looking at its own sort of approach towards AI regulation. And so a key aspect here is that sort of three-party competition between the US, China, and the EU, with the EU trying to find its position there as not having the big tech companies, not having that easy access to the big data sets or the kind of government-driven technology space that China has, the tech leaders being the US one. And so the EU having identified that with the GDPR, for instance, it has a particular capacity around regulatory development and regulation that has found interest in the rest of the world for being replicated. And so trying to use that as a way of positioning itself within the AI space. And what it's really trying to establish is a space where the kinds of AI that would be developed in the EU would be considered globally to be more trustworthy because it is built to live up to high standards of oversight and control, similar to what we might think of with other kinds of products where Europe is trying to position itself not as a cheap, but as a quality kind of producer. And so within this, it is trying to balance between the ecosystem of trust, which is related to regulatory requirements, and one of excellence, which is related to trying to push forward the research and the innovation in this kind of space. So how to balance these two. And what it has really identified is that the sort of the driver for how to choose whether or not a regulatory approach would be proportionate is to relate it to the specific risk that an AI system is posing. And so that means AI risk assessment is a key element. So the EU has followed through the same kind of process of consultations to national strategy, to gap analysis, and then moving towards regulation proposal. In this case, the consultation was sort of the high-level expert group phase. Then came the white paper and its sort of strategy setting. And now in last April, we had the proposed AI Act, the regulation for AI, which is very much a product safety inspired kind of regulation focusing on risk and risk related to the intended use of the AI system. So what does the EU's AI Act entail? Basically, it uses a very broad definition of AI, and the way that I at least interpret this is that it was a deliberate decision to be very broad in the definition of AI, and in that way focus the decision as to whether or not the sort of stringent requirements of this new act would apply to be focused on the intended use as opposed to the methodology, the technology. It is a risk-based one, so the whether or not the system is to be needs to live up to certain regulatory requirements is based on the kinds of impact that it has on humans, on people, be it physical or psychological safety, or impacts on human rights. And that includes things like access to financial resources, such as through credit assessments, access to education, but also things like the way in which the police might, the judicial system might be using AI systems. A tiered compliance system, so saying that the kind of requirements that we will set on AI systems will depend on whether or not they are classified as being in the highest tier, unacceptable, second highest, high risk, not high risk, in which case there's basically very little requirements, or minimal, in which case there are no requirements set by this kind of regulation. I won't be going into the exact details as to which goes into which tier. The importance here is just that a tiered kind of approach is being used for this. Another important aspect is that the focus, as I said, is on intended use of the AI when placed on the market. One implication of this is that if you are developing AI, you're working with AI, but you have no intention of placing it on the market, this act does not actually take any effect on what you are doing. Then the responsibilities and obligations are over the whole value chain. So this is an interesting dimension, which I believe wasn't really discussed much beforehand, but the idea that the obligations do not fall purely on whoever is using the AI system, and using in this case means sort of in the organizational use that are going to have impact on other individuals. And not even only on the party that is putting the system on the market, but that the importer of an AI system or the distributor or the initial developer, all of these will have certain obligations under this regulation. And so this is an interesting concept that the regulation itself already in place is something along the value chain. Whereas in many other cases, we've seen that regulations only really focus on the end party, and it is through contracts within the industry that you get the value chain getting impacted by it. And then in that kind of contractual space where standards such as quality control standards come into play. The extraterritorial scope obviously is important. The fact that this legislation is impacting people, companies, organizations that are developing AI outside of the EU, as long as this AI system is being placed on the market in the EU, or the users are located in the EU, or the output of this system is going to have an impact on people in the EU. In all of these cases, the system would be considered to be within the scope of this legislation. So that means there's a strong impact on actors outside of the EU. Most of the focus in the discussion has been on the assessments that happen before putting on the market, but there's also post-market monitoring, which is going to be important because especially with this new kind of regulation dealing with a new kind of technology for which we don't have a lot of experience, there will be cases that won't be caught. The issues will not be identified in the ex-ante pre-deployment stage. And so monitoring of how the system is operating and then being able to react to that is going to be an important element. Very briefly, the impact on sort of this geopolitics is probably complicated, and we don't really have a clear view on all of that yet. But some of the things to identify are that, for instance, where the US has been focusing on the national security implications recently with their National Security Commission report, the EU Act does not touch on anything to do with military, simply because the military is outside of the mandate of the EU. But also, it doesn't really directly touch on technology research or development, because, as I said, it only applies to products that are being put on the market. And it doesn't really clearly, it's not really that clear how it impacts on dual use technologies, so technologies that have both civilian and military kinds of use. Strategic independence, important for the EU, but not really covered by the AI Act. The remote biometrics is drawing a lot of attention also in this act, same as it has done in various states in the US, but it is less stringent than a lot of the bans that are being talked about in the US. This may have impacts also on suppliers because of its extraterritorial impacts, but also simply because of blocking access to the EU market for developers outside of the EU if they do not decide to follow this. And so in that sense, it may have an impact on the way in which remote biometrics technology is being developed, or certainly put on the market externally in places like China. However, that remains to be seen exactly. Why am I paying so much attention to this act from the EU? Well, first of all, it is a first mover. And any kind of first mover in the regulatory space is going to be important because it will set the theme, the way of thinking about these things that others, as they start working into this, will be looking at. They will be deciding whether they want to follow that direction or not. But the fact that there exists that example will shape the way of thinking. There's also the aspect that the EU, through its member states, is an important player in quite a number of the global organizations that are acting around AI regulation, such as the OECD. 22 of the 37 OECD states are EU states. To name just one, you can see on the slide, this applies to quite a number. So how does the regulation development relate to standards? So a core element here is this statement within the regulation as well, that there are instruments to achieve presumption of conformity, so presumption that you are following the requirements of a regulation. And this is by following standards, and specifically harmonized standards that have been recognized by the, in this case, the EU, but whichever national regulator it is, as being acceptable. And really what you see is that standards are a way in which to provide the detail to how to make yourself compliant, whereas the regulation states sort of the large scale what it is that you want, that you need to achieve. It doesn't set out how to achieve that. Standards can do that. In the case of the GDPR, for instance, there are various ISO standards that can help cloud providers or other technology providers to make sure that they are compliant with the GDPR. And something similar is anticipated for things like the AI Act and for other AI regulation. In the US, for instance, we are actually seeing that standards, NIST, the national standards body, is being put forward as a kind of driver to identify what is good good performance in this space that may then become the trigger for a regulation that would state that you need to follow that kind of requirement. So the standard space is in a sense complicated. There are quite a lot of standards bodies that exist. For starters, every country has its own national standards body. These, however, operate jointly in order to create international standards through the ISO IEC process. Related to artificial intelligence, it's the ISO IEC JTC1 SC42, which is the standards committee that has been created, under which the various AI related standards are being created. IEEE has its own standards, AI standards that are being created, and within its AI standards work, it has the P7000 group that is specifically focusing on ethical aspects of standards. CEN-CENELEC, being the European standards bodies, has created a new JTC, a new Joint Technical Committee that is focusing on AI and is anticipating, has been signaled already by the European Commission, that they will be asked to create particular standards that will be the harmonized standards for enabling conformity with the AI Act. And what all of these do is really, they are identifying particular elements within this, elements such as the issues around bias, and then addressing these in a more systematic and specific kind of way, that they tell you, if you must do these and these steps. If you follow these, then you will be, and you have documented the fact that you are following these, you can evidence it, then you can be certified as conforming with that standard. And if that standard has been accepted as part of the harmonized standards, as part of the routes to be compliant with the regulation, then this is an easier way of showing your compliance. So as I said, the IEEE has a series of standards, the 7000 series, which are focused on ethical issues. And Some of these have already started to come out. ISO has a number of working groups, including, for instance, the working group on trustworthiness, under which bias is handled, but also robustness of systems, for instance. And it also has a working group that is focusing on governance of AI, for instance. All of these are contributing to providing sort of the foundational basis for what exactly you need to do, which processes to put in place. A lot of these are process standards. They are instructing what kind of documentation to provide around the decision-making processes that go into building your systems. Some of them, like the robustness standard, are focusing also on certain particular criteria to follow, particular methodologies for assessing the performance of the system, so that you can clearly signal to anyone who wishes to use your system what the space of variability in the operating domain it is that where the system will be safe to operate. In addition to direct standards work, the IEEE has also been working on ethics certification. So certification being sort of a secondary element to this larger how to use standards to become compliant with regulations. If you have a certification, that basically is the assessment against how you have implemented standards and how also as an organization you have implemented your way of working. And if we can generate globally accepted ways of doing the certification, and that will move us towards being able to do things like clear, trustworthy types of audits, which will allow people to have better assessment regarding the reliability, the transparency, explainability, etc. of AI systems. And this may either be in order to show compliance with regulation, or in a way to preempt the need to create regulations. And with that, I thank you very much, and I'm open to questions if we have enough time.
Thank you, Dr. Koene, for the talk. I think we have time for questions. I do have one question to start with. So I see that there are a lot of standards. It's like a sort of a forest of standards. Do you see any work in sort of a meta framework for standards in which one can understand which standards are sort of compatible with each other, or whether following one standard sort of implies that you follow most of the components of another standard? Do you see any work in that direction?
This is a very important issue. It applies to AI standard, it applies to other standards as well. One of the so generally the movement that we see is once standards become completed and published, that other standards bodies will pay attention to the work that a particular standards body has done, and that there is a push to try to create a sort of unified standard. So you will see, for instance, in certain domains that you will have an ISO, IEC, IEEE standard, which means the two different standards organizations have actually come together to create a joint one, because exactly that, they want to avoid this kind of confusion in the space. At this moment, most of the standards that you've seen on the slides that are presented are not actually completed. They are in progress. There is an attempt to communicate between the standards organizations, but that has challenges to it. Generally speaking, the strongest consolidation comes after a certain standard is published. Specifically when it comes to something like Sensenelec and its instruction by the European Commission to create harmonized standards, Sensenelec core approach is to say that if there exists an international standard like ISO, IEC standards that provides what is necessary for this purpose, then their focus will be in integrating, importing that standard, and basically just approving it by Sensenelec for European use instead of building a new one. So this is the community is cognizant of this challenge. It is difficult to avoid at the development stage because every group identifies, of course, a problem, starts working on it, and those kinds of things.
I think, yeah, it'll slowly emerge. I think a meta standard will slowly. That makes sense. I think Selmer has a question. I think he.
Oh, yes, thank you. Let me lower my hand first. Yes. Okay. Yes, thank you. That was really great, and very reassuring. It's amazing how much great work is going into these standards and regulations for, as I see it, the human agent case. The governance of AI presumably is, I picked up on that phrase in one of your slides anyway, is carried out by humans. And I'm assuming that's in your mind, in the minds of your colleagues and co-workers in this effort, very different than standards for artificial agents themselves. So unless you stop me, I'm going to assume that's correct, that these are standards for the governance and regulation of human beings who create, use, and are impacted by artificial agents. My concern, so that's, it's great. As I said, my concern is that we don't have any standards for the machines themselves. And you mentioned in passing that machine learning might be, in the minds of some, inappropriate for some purposes. Yesterday, we had part of Icarus actually devoted to that, where we brought together probably arguably the top 6 or 7 groups in the world working on installation of serious ethical control in machines. And we're all doing radically different things, even within the formal methods paradigm. So my question is, I guess overall, is there a way to bridge to this next phase? If there isn't, then I'm concerned because machines are going to get increasingly autonomous. So the best of intentions and procedures and engineering policies may be in place, but if you release a truly autonomous machine into the environment, I'm not entirely sure how, unless it has internal controls, things are going to go the way we want it to go.
It's absolutely true that the majority of standards work that is currently happening is focusing on the procedures of the organizations, the procedures that the developers are following. So basically the humans who are doing the development of the AI. There is work happening that touches on the properties of the AI system itself. They tend to be focusing on things like proof of robustness or things like that, proving the safe operational space, or potentially proving that you have a fail-safe mode, so that if the system goes into failure, it will not cause terrible consequences. None of these is completed, these standards work, but there is work happening in that kind of space. There is, however, also a recognition that the standards development process itself it was created in a previous era. It is even struggling with agile methods of development by humans of technology, to how exactly to frame a standard process in a way that will fit an agile development process is in itself already a challenge. And then to say, how are we going to make, provide a standard that gives the kind of safeguards around a system that is continuously self-modifying is something that I haven't seen an actual standard that is really trying to address as of yet. It has come up occasionally in conversation that this is a thing, that is, but if there are people who have good ideas around how to approach this in a standard, I think the community will be very interested in hearing from them. This, I believe, there is not yet really clear idea of how to approach that challenge.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I have a question too. First, a comment. Ansgar, thanks very much for being here. I am Isabel, the one who invited you in the first place. So I really appreciate your effort, your interest in being here and talking with us and in this excellent keynote. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask something that I hope it isn't very inconvenient, that I think you mentioned slightly. And the thing is, getting back to all the proliferation of texts, recommendations, guidelines, regulations, and all the immense work on the standards side. But leaving the standards now for the next part of what I'm saying, just concerning the guidelines and the recommendations, don't you think in an issue that it is so important as it is the integration of intelligent machines properly regulated in our human environment? Wouldn't it be a priority? Now that everyone is talking about ethics, about collaboration, etc., wouldn't it be a priority to have this convergence of stakeholders in regional terms, and not? And now I'm going to tell you all my feelings about this. It's a rush, a fierce competition. When it started. And I think the last phase of a controlled thing was the ethically designed texts that were issued by the IEEE, and that in fact, and all that work in the standards that has been developed is what I would consider a more universal conversions to regulate and to think about really prior issues, because it has people from all the fields and regional sectors, not so concerned with the politics of a region or the economics or etc., but really concerned with technological development and its ethical deployment. So what I think it's, I must say, I was really disappointed, and I even told at the time at someone at the high-level committee, and we were just in the very start. Now I'm sure there is, and even the EU and GPI and everything, and OCDE and World Bank, and it's just, in my opinion, not a good approach to the problem, because there is this proliferation of texts and guidelines. One gets exhausted. I talk for myself, reading all of that. Many are redundant. Some don't bring really nothing new. And it would be much better if there was this convergence of efforts from all the regions in this common effort to deploy something that will affect humanity as a whole. And I think this, as it happened in COVID-19 in the first place, that all the scientists, everybody, in the first phase, I must say, converge in that common effort to overcome what was a problem for humanity. Now there should be this convergence and not this competition, because I want to be the first to produce this, to have a kind of regulatory control and obviously an economic control and political control on the overall regional thing, world thing. And so I think the standards, they could be, if not infected by this same problem, they could be a solution if they could comprehend people and experts from everywhere. And also, it would be important, something that Selmer pointed out, and I feel it as a very important thing. Some people are debating automation and deployment of automation without having the minimal practical experience of the thing. And yesterday, as Selma pointed out, we had these experts that are really working with deployment of machines, and they have all those risk assessment, the metrics for the interaction, etc. They have been working on these in the last decade or two, and they have come to these results that are very concrete. And I think that the people in the standards, I don't mean the people in the regulations, because this is another subject, but at least in the standards, these they should be there, because they are the ones who can talk about things and deliver evidence about how intelligence systems are being deployed, what are the consequences of this deployment, what had to be reformulated, and this is a very, very substantial evidence, very important evidence, and we are not building standards from the scratch. There's this huge experience with intelligent systems that has to be taken into account. And in fact, the industrial robotics is, in my modest opinion, the most developed, and probably also the army stuff, but I'm not pointing to that. But the industrial robotics is the field that, in my opinion, is most developed. I've told someone yesterday from the group that I consider that the real social robotics is emerging from there, and not so much the traditionally called social robotics field. The real social robots are going to emerge from there, from the necessity of having robots and people cooperating at the workspace, and all the work that has been developed there. So it was really important to have this convergence. Perhaps this is an utopic thing, to have China, to have Asia, to have the United States, to have Europe working together, to have Africa, because AI is already being deployed in Africa, and to have all these people working together to achieve a common basis that would allow intelligent systems to be deployed in diverse social and economic contexts, but to be deployed with respecting human beings and their well-being, and being really a tool for the progress of humanity. So that's what I wanted to tell you.
Sure. You've made some very important points, and there is definitely concern around the fracturing of the regulatory oversight kind of space around these kinds of things. And in a sense, standards are a positive light in this, because even with the US and the EU and China, etc., going their own way to a certain extent when it comes to their national regulations, at least all of them are still focusing on the international standards bodies as the place that is recognized as this is where standard setting should happen, because everybody recognizes that these technologies go across borders, and that the best way of making sure that the way in which whatever regulation you are setting is going to be implemented in a good way by everybody globally is to put that into an international standard. So we see in the ISO standards working groups, we do get proposals from China, from the US, from European countries. Also in the standard space, in the international standard space, Africa, South America, the global South, generally speaking, is not present to the extent that it should be. The other big element that is lacking in the standards development space is significant input from the non-corporate space, input from the civil society, from the academic community. And this is, in a sense, not just down to the standards bodies themselves, because all of these standards organizations are open. There's no need to be a corporate member in order to be a standards development participant. The reason why we don't see enough participation by things like academia tends to be that the academic institutions don't have a clear way of recognizing participation in standards work as being something that was a valuable piece of work as an academic. There have been conversations in the Sensenelec context, in its roadmap, its recommendation to the EU, it said that Horizon Europe grant funds should potentially be pushing for academics to at least provide input into the standards. That's just one example. The biggest sort of hurdle for civil society and others to joining standards working groups is that all of the work is voluntary. That is to say, the standards organization will not compensate you for any cost related to your time or even for traveling to conferences and those kinds of things. Industry has the ability to basically assign somebody to be their standards person, and then that is no longer voluntary, that becomes their job. And that's a way in which they can actually dedicate time to doing standards, which hugely skews the field of who is having an impact in the direction that these is taking. And that is a problem, because it makes standards potentially a way to undermine a democratic process of rule setting, because even if the regulations are developed by a democratically elected parliament, but the regulations don't give the details of how to implement it, and then those details get filled in by a non-elected industry body, that undermines the extent to which the common person feels that the way this stuff is representing them. And of course, none of this is addressing the problem of actually how do we get this to be truly a global effort as opposed to a wealthy nation's effort. So yeah.
Did you have something, Isabel? Or
I got disconnected. Sorry,
Sure.
I'm back. Okay. About standards, still about standards. I'm going to give you a confession. As far as I could see, some standards, and I have already told Gurvinder Virk about this, or someone else. They are, for instance, when IEEE produced that the ethically designed text with the participation of a huge amount of people that dedicated their time and their effort to that text. And also, I realized that the work that is going on discussing the problems so that some the working groups so that some standards are approached is voluntary, and it's people don't get any money for that. I think this would be fair, because it would be a contribution to the development of something that is useful for the community, and many are willing and glad to participate in that. But the thing that I don't agree at all is, for instance, if I want to read a standard, the text, and I look at the price I have to pay, and I have tried this for several times, it's horrible. It's a huge amount of money. I can't afford it. It's just like this. And I ask, why? This should be available. This is, I must say that you may find me mad for saying this, but to me, the standards should be available, be public and available for all those that are or were interested in those standards. Of course, for the general public, maybe some are so specific that, okay, their reading would be even not accessible. But I can't understand why the product of voluntary work that gives origin to that piece of information isn't available to those interested. And I think this is a problem. For me, it's a problem because I can't understand how something that is made by a common effort gets a commodity. It's shocking to me.
The only thing I can say to that is that I wholeheartedly agree.
It's shocking. That's the only thing. Well, okay. This is just a confession. But I really appreciated your keynote, and you brought very important issues and it's the nicest way to finish our conference this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. If there are no more questions, we can thank Dr. Koene and close this session. Thank you, Dr. Koene, for the great talk, and we are very grateful for your participation in the conference. We learned a lot, and it's, as Isabel said, it's a great end of the conference with a great discussion.